Okay, good morning. I have to admit I've been skating a little bit on the videos that I made last semester and haven't done too many. I haven't needed to do too many for this semester. But also, I've been pretty shaken up by the events of January 6th when the group attacked the Capitol. It's a pretty serious event. I'm not exactly sure what it all signifies. I've been sort of at a loss since 2018 when there was this big controversy about Trump calling certain African countries and Haiti shithole countries. That that's sort of understandable. That's the way he talks. He's from Queens, and it wasn't like it wasn't a press conference. But what really shook me up was that I saw a panel on a news show, MSNBC or something, and they were trying to parse, they were trying to decide whether he said shithouse or shithole, and as though that made a difference, and that completely confused me. I really haven't known what was going on since then. But if we want to understand what went on with the Capitol thing. It's a history class, so we have to go back a little bit further, okay? And I'll try to keep this really short. It's a minute. It's almost 2 minutes at this point, and I haven't really said anything. So I'm sorry. I'm a long-winded old guy. I used to tell stories around the table with my kids and make them stop, pause Family Guy when there was some kind of, one of those breakaways to Nixon or something, and I would explain what the joke was, because they didn't live through that. They don't know what the hell's going on. So, and my daughter would always roll her eyes, but now she teaches history, so watch out. We have a two-party system in this country, and that's because there are certain structural features built into the Constitution that make it nearly impossible for a third party, a third or fourth party to exist. The last successful third party was the Republican Party, founded in 1850, electing Lincoln in 1860. But it didn't stay a third party for very long because the Whigs went out of existence. The Whigs couldn't deal with the question of slavery, so they went out of existence. So we've had a two-party system from 1860. And the Democrats go back even further to the 1830s or so, when Andrew Jackson sort of expanded the suffrage to all white males, whether they had property or not. We had this two-party system, Democrats and Republicans from 1860. But an odd thing about American political parties is they don't necessarily have a strict ideology, or at times they don't have a strict ideology. Today there are kind of strict ideological divisions between Democrats and Republicans, but it wasn't always that case. That wasn't always the case. And what I mean by ideological, question of abortion. If somebody is anti-abortion, or pro-life as they want to call it, they're probably Republicans. If they are pro-choice or pro-abortion, nobody wants to call themselves pro-abortion, they are probably Democrats, right? There are certain things that can separate them, right? For the longest time, for let's see, 1830s, 70 years, and maybe the 1970, probably 140 years, the Democrats, part of the Democrats' support was the white South, the white slave-owning, segregationist, Jim Crow, anti-civil rights for black people South, all right? and they call it the Solid South. You can look through the textbook at all the different presidential elections, and the South goes for Democrats always. Even when in 1928 they run a Catholic, Al Smith runs for president on the Democratic ticket. And even though white Southerners who were Protestants for the most part, members of the Ku Klux Klan, hate Catholics, he still carries most of the South. Okay, black people, when they get emancipated and then they get voting rights, for the most part, vote Republican. And when I put up that thing in the artifact assignment of the 7 members of Congress, a few people were suspicious that they only came from the South. The reason for that is simply that like 90% of the African Americans in the United States were in the South in 1870. Right? That's the only place they had voting strength. Certainly to elect a senator, which is a statewide thing, and or in sufficient numbers in individual congressional districts to elect African Americans to Congress, to the House of Representatives. Okay, blacks vote Republican, white Southerners vote for the Democrats. Okay, the Democrats also have support from immigrant communities in the North. Irish and Germans, and I guess Italians eventually. Jews tend to vote for Democrats in cities like Boston and New York and Chicago. Okay, and that's sort of the system. Over the years, both parties tended to have both conservative wings and more liberal wings. All right. So in the 60s, you had George Wallace was a Democrat, and he's standing in the doors of the University of Alabama trying to block black people from coming in. And he's giving a speech where he says segregation now, segregation then, and segregation forever, or something like that. You might have seen it in the movie Forrest Gump. And so that's on the one hand, very conservative, very backward, very white supremacist. But you also had people like FDR, Hubert Humphrey, who wanted to expand benefits to workers, who were supportive of unions, and those kinds of things. Okay, so you had 2 different wings in that party. In the Republican Party, it was the same deal. You had people like Barry Goldwater, who ran for president in 1964, very conservative, sort of a Cold Warrior, suspicious of communism and all that kind of thing. Joe McCarthy was a Republican, a very conservative Republican. On the other hand, you had I'm not sure I consider him a liberal, but Nelson Rockefeller is the governor of New York State in the 60s and 70s, and he is considered a liberal Republican. Other people like Jacob Javits were clearly liberal Republicans. Okay, so what changes? What changes is that in beginning with Rosa Parks and the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, and then sit-ins in the South at Woolworths, and voter registration drives in Mississippi, and the violence and all that kind of stuff. The Democrats, first John Kennedy, he's kind of reluctant to get to pass. Well, he finds it difficult to pass civil rights legislation because of that big part of the Democratic Party that is anti-civil rights, the white Southerners, But he gets shot in Dallas clearly a formerly Confederate state, and I don't want to get into that, but I will say this: Elvis Presley had dealings with Jack Ruby, who shot Oswald. So I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, when LBJ comes into the presidency, he's the vice president. Kennedy gets shot. He becomes the president. He's a Democrat from the South, and he's somebody he's been a senator for a very long time and knows all the ins and outs of getting legislation passed. And he wants to pass a Civil Rights Act in 1964. The only way to do it is to get all the liberals from the Democratic Party. He's not going to get votes from those Southern Democrats. All the liberals from the Democratic Party, Northern liberals basically, and however many liberals from the Republican Party that he can get, okay? Which was, at that time, was a possibility. There were liberal Republicans. And that's how he gets the act passed. 1964 is the Civil Rights Act. It's the second Civil Rights Act. The first one is in 1866. And then in 1965, he gets the Voting Rights Act passed. And now, the roadblocks to blacks voting in the South are taken away. They're removed. And so, in a lot of parts of the South, there's maybe not 90% of the African Americans, but there's still a large block of African Americans who can vote. And although blacks traditionally had voted Republican, in the Great Depression and the New Deal, this started to change. Okay, FDR was able to he wasn't really great on civil rights, but the New Deal programs attracted more black voters. In places where blacks could vote, they started to switch to the Democratic Party. Okay? That's the point I'm trying to make. And when blacks in the South got to be able to vote in the mid-'60s and on, they voted for Democrats. They tried to take control of the Democratic Party in the South. And it's quite a struggle, a lot of violence and stuff like that. And at that point, the white Southerners who had they had been Democrats, they had been members of the Klan, they had been advocates of slavery in the past, their grandfathers and great-grandfathers. Those people began to shift to the Republican Party. They didn't want to be in a party with black people. That's what it comes down to. Pure and simple white supremacy. Okay? The Democratic Party was fine as long as it was mostly white or all white in the South. But now that it's becoming kind of, a little darker, I don't want anything to do with it. And they switched their allegiances to the Republican Party. It starts as a trickle, and then it just becomes a flood. In 1968, George Wallace, who was standing in, from the Forrest Gump movie, was in the doors of the University of Alabama, trying to block black students. And in 1968, he runs on an independent ticket, a third party, and I think he gets shot during that campaign, and he ends up in a wheelchair. But he carries a bunch of states in the South who are not. They're not willing to vote for Hubert Humphrey, the liberal Democratic candidate. And I guess they didn't feel right voting for a Republican, Nixon, either. But Wallace takes a bunch of votes from the Democrats, and Nixon ends up winning. Okay, that's sort of the start of this shift. You know, Southern Democrats, Southern white Democrats, feel themselves out of place in this Democratic Party that now has many African American voters. By 1980, it's a done deal. And if you look in the textbook at these presidential election maps, they don't have one for every 4 years, but you'll see that between, well, let's see, Jimmy Carter runs in 76. He's a Democrat. He's a Southerner. He's from Georgia. And he's a born-again Christian. Okay? Southern Democrats are fine with him in 76. They vote for him. They don't realize what a liberal he is. But you'll see that's in 76. The Democrats carry the South. I think it's the last time they carry the South. By 1980, the South goes overwhelmingly, well, the whole country goes overwhelmingly for Reagan. All right? So the shift has happened. Okay? Now, I wanted to keep this to 15 minutes, and I'm a little over anyway. But this is necessary to understand if we're going to figure out this capital thing. And I will be talking about it more a little later on. Okay, I'm going to get into a nice putting up videos constantly, especially if I can get my hair. I tried to cut my hair myself, and I don't think I did a very good job. Anybody out there cut hair? I got to get that piece. But I want to get into a sort of a flow of these things. So keep that in mind. Democrats and Republicans, up until the 1970s, and then they sort of switch tracks, and they become rigidly sort of ideological. There are no Republican liberals anymore. There's a few moderates, you know. It's the guy from Utah, and the woman from Maine, Susan Collins, and why can't I remember his name? Because I'm old. Mitt Romney. There are a few moderate Republicans, but there's not any real liberal Republicans. And there are a few, you know, there's a guy in West Virginia on the Democratic side that in order to get elected in a very red state, he has to be sort of on the edge. But generally, Democrats are liberals these days, and Republicans are conservatives. The Republican Party is a pretty white party. I don't know what the percentage of, Hispanic or Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, or African Americans in the party is, but I know that when you have to brag, as Trump does, that I got 9% of the African American vote, it's not that great, you know? 9%, not that great. It's 1 out of every 10 African Americans. All right, but this is all important in leading up to this, you know, to the Trump presidency and to this attack on the Capitol. Somebody asked me if I was going to talk about that, and I will, but I wanted to lay this foundation as well. This is mostly for the 131 class, the U.S. history, but I think I'm going to post it on the 117 classes also, because I want you to understand how the world works. It's kind of my job here, okay? So I'll speak to you again in a day or two. Thank you. Bye-bye.